Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first Sunday of Cider Week Finger Lakes 2020. I'm Scott Ramsey from the New York Cider Association, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this orchard tour of Black Diamond Farm. But before we get to that, I just want to give a call out to our website, ciderweekflx.com. All of our events are listed over on that site, and there's a lot of really exciting things happening today. You'll enjoy this orchard tour now. And then tonight, virtually at 5 o'clock, we have a happy hour cocktail recipe with Rootstock, who's hosting our happy hours this week. And they're tonight going to prepare the apple bomb. So you can join me back here at 5 p.m. for that. And then today, we also have in-person events where we can be safe and socially distanced. So Lake Drum Brewing is having a chef there, and he is preparing paw tacos al pastor that pair beautifully with cider. That sounds amazing and delicious. And then Eve Cidery is doing some tastings this afternoon. They're at their beautiful, beautiful cidery just south of Ithaca. So go online to our events tab at ciderweekflx.com and make sure if you need tickets, you're getting them. In a lot of places, we're trying to keep things limited capacity to keep everybody safe and socially distanced. But yeah, so check out our events tab and check out our website. There's also a tab that shows you where to buy all your cider. But without further ado, I want to get to this orchard tour because it's really fantastic. I have actually prepared myself a little mimosa with black diamond slate stone. It's delicious. I'm going to enjoy that along the way during the tour. Hope you've got your delicious cider brunch cocktail ready to go. And we will get started. I'm going to go through all the motions here of connecting everything. All right, here we go.
Hi, folks. I'm Ian Merwin, and we're in the middle of Black Diamond Farm and Cider. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody. We're here on Black Diamond Farm and Cider. We wanted to start this video by introducing everybody on the crew. My name is Ian Merwin. Jackie Merwin, my wife. We bought this land and started the farm in 1992, so 28 years ago. And the folks that make things possible that with cider making in the orchard in here, I wanted to introduce Christian Veronita. He's the head cider maker and orchardist. This is Alan Romanix, a Cornell student, taking a semester off. And this is Dominic Costa, who's part of the regular crew, co-cider maker, co-orchardist. And this is Rosie and her sidekick Dobie. They're in charge of rodent control on the farm.
All right. So we grow about 150 different kinds of fruit on this farm, about 130 different kinds of apples. And I want to talk a little bit about what we grow and how we grow it. So this is a row. This is actually one of our newer blocks. It was planted 10 years ago now. And these are mostly modern varieties, dessert apples. And our emphasis on the modern varieties is growing things that are disease resistant to minimize the need for fungicides. And this is an apple called Crimson Crisp that came from Jules Janik's breeding program. It's very disease resistant. It's a good keeper. It actually makes a good cider as well. So it's what I would call a dual purpose apple. On the right here is a very new variety, one of the what are called proprietary varieties released by Cornell University. And this Snapdragon to the right, and this is Ruby Frost here. Those are apples that are only grown in New York State. So here's two more apples that we grow on the farm. The one on my right here is an old English apple, a couple hundred years old, called Ashmead's Kernel. And kernel for old English apples just means it was a seedling tree. And you can see we grow a lot of apples with this kind of rough sandpapery finish. These in France and Spain, they call them Renette apples, or Renetta in Spain. That means princess. And it's kind of a European thing that I have really emphasized in our apple varieties. But the russet apples tend to have very dense flesh, to be fairly acidic or tart, and you get some spicy sort of cinnamon ginger flavors from the skin of those apples when you make a hard cider. So it's when we do chemical analyses of our ciders, there's always a lot of hydroxycinnamic acid, which is really coming from these. And this is what I would call a dual purpose apple that people love. People that like a tart, russet type apple just love this. So it works really well for us because we make about half of the cash flow on the farm from fresh fruit, mostly sold locally at the farmers market or Green Star Cooperative Market in Ithaca, or shipping. We ship stuff to the Park Slope Co-op through a food hub, and so this kind of apple is really important for us. Heirloom variety, good for cider, good for eating. Really, these apples work well for us. And on the other side, this is another modern variety called Sundance. It's a full sister to Gold Rush, which is an important apple we'll look at in a minute. And that's a modern variety that's, again, a very disease resistant, um, beautiful blush finish. And so that's one that we sell mostly for fresh consumption. So I wanted to talk for a minute about the mulch, the wood chip mulch that you see under these trees. This is actually a ground cover or soil health system that I worked with a lot when I was working at Cornell for 28 years. And whenever we take down any trees on the farm, we grind them up into chips, and then we compost those chips for a couple of years, and we spread them under the trees. It's actually really sort of boosts the biological activity of the soil. It's really good for the soil microbiome, and it also closes the nutrient cycles. We use very, very little fertilizer on the farm. The soils are really good. It's a what's called a glacial till soil. That means it was what was dropped out by the glaciers as they began to recede. Lots of limestone in it, which gives you a relatively high pH. It's what's called a sweet soil or sweet land. And so by using the wood mulch that comes from trees elsewhere in the farm, we're sort of keeping the nutrient cycles right here tight on the farm. So on the right here is it's a tart cherry that we grow. And we grow three different kinds of tart cherries here. They're all Hungarian varieties. This one's called Jubileum, or Agri Jubileum, or Erdi Jubileum, I guess it is in Hungarian. And it's a relatively sweet tart cherry. The Hungarian tarts were actually developed, they're old varieties. They were developed for making tart cherry wine, most of which then got distilled to make cherry brandies, which is an important beverage in Eastern Europe. Uh, this we planted actually intending to make tart cherry wine out of it, but it turns out that people just love this cherry, and my wife gets most of them now to sell at the Ithaca Farmers Market. So, and this is an example of another strategy that we have on the farm, which is to try to be very diversified so that we have a mixture of different kinds of fruit growing. And in a one year you might have a light crop of the apples, you've got other things to fill the gaps, or the reverse. So by having a lot of diversity in what we grow, it gives us a little more economic stability for keeping the farm going. Okay, so here's another one of the kind of weird apples that we grow. This one, there's a guy named Albert Eder, was an apple breeder on the West Coast, and he developed a lot of red-fleshed apples. A lot of people trying to make rosé ciders these days are planting these. It's a tart apple, very unusual in that it has most apples, the genes for red color and the skin are turned on, and the ones in the flesh are turned off. And on this apple, it's the reverse. So when you start to see this kind of pink coloration, it's not in the skin, it's actually in the underlying flesh. And that's how you know they're ripe, when you begin to see that pink kind of coming through the skin.
This is an important apple in our uh, rabble rouser cider. Gives it, if you have enough of it, you get a kind of an orangey or slightly pink hue to it. And we'll look at another red fleshed apple later on, which is called Robert's Crab, which is a very, very darkly pigmented variety. Again, a rosé cider apple. So this is another apple that we really love. Um, and this one, people always ask me what my favorite apple is, and I always tell them it's like asking you what your favorite kid is if you got a bunch of kids. But this would certainly be high on my list. Cox Orange Pippin is an old English variety. It's kind of the quintessential English dessert apple. It's a really important mother. We have its daughters and its granddaughters and its great granddaughters on the farm. And it's a rennet, right? Lightly russeted, very acidic, um, really good eating apple, and also a very good cider apple. There's quite a bit of this in our first fling and rabble rouser, the early ciders that we make. So here's another heirloom russet type apple. Uh, Dual purpose, really good for eating, good for cider. And this one's called Roxbury Russet. It was named in Roxbury, Massachusetts, and it's the oldest named North American apple variety. 1640 it was named. It's a tart apple. It's got that russety skin flavor and cider. And this one, we'll be picking these, start picking them in about 2 weeks. So all the orchards on this farm are what's called high density. And that means that the above ground part of the tree, what we call the scion or the fruit variety, is grafted onto a actually different genotype. The root system is a different kind of apple. And they're grafted, and dwarfing rootstocks, which these all are, control the above ground vigor, size of the tree. So in a high density orchard, the trees partition much more of their reserves to fruit and less to root growth and shoot growth. We call that the harvest index. And these are very productive systems. To the amount of food that you can grow on an acre of land is very high in the high density orchard. There's a lot of mythology where people say you get better fruit from the big old standard trees, and there's been a lot of research done on that, and it's not true. Uh, Not at all true. In fact, you get much better fruit quality on a smaller tree that's more compact, because on this size of tree, the entire tree is available to sunlight, so you have full sun on the fruit pretty much all through the tree, and that sunlight is what drives photosynthesis, and the photosynthesis is what creates all your flavor compounds and the sugar. And so it's these systems. When I originally started planting, we had some bigger trees, and then when we compared the fruit quality for the same variety on the small trees versus the big ones, we really quickly realized that we didn't want to be growing the big ones, because the fruit quality, both for cider and for dessert, is just a lot better. And you can see, looking down this row, these trees are 10 years old, actually 12 years old, 2008, this planting went in. And this is a typical crop load. So each one of these trees has probably 75 or 80 pounds of fruit. And it's all, you can see by the way the sunlight's going into the trees, that it's all, there's really good air circulation and sunlight penetration. And that also gives you a lot fewer disease problems, because most of the diseases for apple are fungi, and in kind of a dark, shady, moist interior volume of a big tree, you get a lot of fungal infections that are much less of a problem on this kind of tree. So this is another oddball apple that we grow. This is called Hudson's Golden Gem, and it was an accidental seedling, or somebody discovered it in the fence along their orchard in Oregon in the 1930s. Very unusual pear shape, heavily russeted. This apple feels like it needs a shave. It's really bristly almost. And this, we've had some nice cold
cold days that are great for red color. So it's basically a yellow apple. It's really unusual flavor. It tastes kind of like, to me, it tastes like vanilla custard or vanilla ice cream. And the texture is almost like a pear. It's like an Asian pear. It's very delicate, kind of almost a fluffy texture. So here's another oddball. This apple is called Blue Pearmaine, and I believe it originated in Maine more than 100 years ago. So this is what we would call an heirloom variety, an old, traditional local variety. These are almost, well, about 2 weeks now from being ripe, but as they ripen, the color really gets darker and darker and darker, and hence they have a little bit of a bluish tinge now. And this is another example of an apple that really, as it ripens, you get this bloom, the waxy layer that's part of the blue color is actually the silver gray of the wax. And that's a sign that the fruit is ripening when you see that wax layer. So you've all probably eaten Honeycrisp. And when Honeycrisp was introduced, it was supposed to be a cross between Macao and Honeygold, which is an apple they just grow in Minnesota. And this is an apple we've been growing since 1993. One of my favorites. It's called Keepsake. And when they actually were going to patent Honeycrisp, they had to genotype it to get the patent. And when they genotyped it, it turned out it had no relationship to Macao or Honeygold. And turns out this was one of the parents of it, this apple Keepsake. So if you like Honeycrisp and you ever have a chance to taste a Keepsake apple, I really encourage you to do it. It's never become an important commercial cultivar because, as you can see, it's somewhat of a rough-looking apple. It's kind of blotchy, which actually Honeycrisp also is. Tends to be pretty rough-looking, but this is where Honeycrisp got its flavor and its texture from this apple. It's a great apple. Minnesota, good keeper. Um, it's actually Northern Spy is part of the parentage for it too. So this little pond is the canary in the mine for us. And what I mean by that is before I planted any trees in this field, I put in almost a mile of drainage lines in the ground because it's a great soil, but it's in the springtime it tends to really hold on to water and be a little too wet for the roots on the trees. So it's all piped, and anything that penetrates and goes into the drain lines ends up coming into this pond. We're 3 months into a pretty significant drought here, so the pond is mostly just mud now. But the idea here is that anything that goes into the ground that leaches or drains out of this orchard goes through this pond. On the other side, there's a pipe that goes into the little creek. And as soon as we have water in it again, I'll put some minnows in it. I usually put golden shiners in it. And that way, any nutrients that are leaching out of the orchard will be captured here. And cattails is a very high biomass crop. So essentially, this little pond is what's called bioremediation, where it guarantees that no nutrients are going to leach or out of this orchard and end up in Cayuga Lake, which is about a mile down this creek here. It goes right into the lake. And the lake is the drinking water source for most of the towns and communities in this area. And to show you what a good biomass accumulator cattails are, that mound there all came out of this pond 5 years ago. I rented an excavator and dug all the muck out of here, got the cattails out and piled it up there. So that's essentially what you're looking at is the biomass that was created by these cattails over about a 10-year period. Okay, so this pile here with the little locust seedlings growing out of it is our pumice pile. That's 4 years worth of pumice. And the pumice is the stuff that's left over after you press the cider. So you grind the apples, make something like applesauce, you press that, you get the liquid out, the fresh cider. And what's left is a lot of the solids from the fruit, a lot of pectin, still a fair amount of liquid and sugar in it. And we have a trailer that we fill with it whenever we make cider, and then I bring the trailer out and we dump it here. And after this stuff has had 4, 5, 6 years to compost, it becomes something that you can use for our blueberries, because the blueberries, it's a that whole family, the Aircaceous family, like rhodies, blueberries, uh, they require an acid soil for nutritional health. And the soils here, as I said before, are actually not acidic. They're slightly on the basic side. So it helps the blueberries to put an acid mulch on them. And that's what this is. This is our blueberry mulch pile. Traditionally, most of the rootstocks that apples were grafted onto before we had clonal rootstocks were seedlings that came from pumice piles. And before I turned this whole thing over with the tractor, there was thousands of little apple seedlings that were popping up out of the seeds that were in the pumice. So we have 5 ponds on the farm, and all of our orchards have drip irrigation. And if you're not familiar with that, it's just a little tube that has a little dribbler in it. So it's a way to give a limited amount of water. They don't put out a lot of water. But in a drought year like this, it's very important for the young trees, especially, to be able to irrigate them. And this is where the water for this orchard enters. It goes through a little filter that's in this canister here. And it actually comes in just by gravity, because the pond that the water comes from is about 23 feet higher than this. So basically, once we get the lines all filled, we can just open the valve and it irrigates. Say a few words about energy and climate change and solar power. So we have 4 refrigerated rooms in this farm. 2 of them you can drive a tractor in and out of them, so they're big, and we use a lot of electricity here. Used to be we would get bills this time of year when it was hot and we were moving hot fruit into them. I'd get a bill for $600, $700 every month from Nice Egg. And a couple of years after we built the coolers, I decided we were going to put PV arrays, solar arrays up. So we did. We started with this one. We actually had to cut. This was all forest in here, so we had to take the trees out. And that's where those chips came from that I talked about earlier. The mulch that we use in the tree rows, that was trees that came out of here. Chris and I spent about 2 weeks logging and put the arrays up, and we went from $600 to $700 per month bills to Nice Egg owing us a couple $100 a month during the summer. So there's never been a better time for people, if you have any kind of a business or lifestyle where you use a lot of electricity. Solar power is really cheap now, thanks mostly to China. The Chinese have driven the price of the actual panels way down, and it really works. You know, it's all summer long. We're at the maximum that we could have without being considered a commercial producer by our local utility. But we're pretty much self-sufficient and putting electricity into the grid for about 4 or 5 months a year. And then in the winter, of course, you don't get much generation from a PV system around here. But really a good thing to do. So this is our newest orchard. And this orchard, we have 101 different varieties of apples. They are all apples that are really good for making hard cider. Some of them are dual purpose. They're also good eating apples, but it's basically heirloom American cider varieties and Old English and French and Spanish cider varieties. So it's 101 varieties, 2,500 trees. We started planting this orchard in 2015. Chris and I fenced it in 2014, started planting the next year. And we do, each year we'd plant another 500 trees. The rows have about 100 trees apiece. And last year we got to the very far corner where we're almost out of room in here. So in order to keep track of what's here, I have a good friend who's a sign maker, and we actually made signs because when we were coming out here looking for like this morning, we were talking about picking the Egremont russets, and it took a while for us to remember which row the Egremont russets are in. So the sign at the end of each row has what's in that row, the number of trees, like here. So this is 20 trees on Geneva 935, that's a clonal rootstock, relatively new one, and 30 trees on Geneva 30, that's sort of an older generation Cornell rootstock. And that's Ashmead's kernel is the apple. And then Phil Barrow's an old English apple, they're on G30, and Ellis Bitter is an English bittersweet, early ripening apple, we picked those already. So each row tells us how many trees and what rootstock they're on. And it helps us orienting if we want to go look for something. It's also, I love having them here for doing tours, taking people through the orchard. This is the same kind of system, medium high density. It's about 700 trees per acre. And these are 5-year-old trees, 4-year-old trees, 3-year-old, 2-year-old, 1-year-old. So as you go to the east. And let's take a quick look at a few interesting varieties here. So this is a cider apple called Wixon crab. And the word crab for apples just means a little apple. Usually it's a not Malus domestica, the big dessert apple that we eat. But this one is actually has very, very sweet, acidic, aromatic juice. So a lot of people really like it for making cider. And these are 4-year-old trees. You can see the amount of fruit on them is kind of amazing this year. When we pick these apples, these branches will pop back up. But that's almost too much fruit for 1 year on these. And this is the drip irrigation tube that I was talking about. That's a technology, actually, the Israelis developed drip irrigation. And they're still the main providers. This is a company called Netafim that makes this stuff. So one of the things I love about having a commercial cidery is that when we got that license in 2013, that's the year I retired from Cornell. And if you make cider, every fruit can be used essentially. If it's rotten, you can't use it, but that's a very small portion of what's harvested here. So before, when we were basically just selling dessert fruit, the farmer's market and stuff, as we were picking any apple that had any kind of a cosmetic blemish or any defect, even if it didn't affect its edibility, basically we just have to drop them all on the ground because we couldn't do anything with them commercially. But when you make cider, essentially anything that, even if you're growing it as a dessert apple, if you can't sell it for whatever reason, as long as it's not rotten, then you just divert it into cider. So it makes the whole farm operation way more efficient, and it closes that cycle where you're not wasting time and money and fruit. This is an apple called Gold Rush that came from the same Jules Janik's breeding program that I talked about earlier. It's a very disease-resistant apple, a very productive tree, and we have a lot of customers that love it as a dessert apple. If you don't like a really tart, hard apple, then it's probably not for you. But we have a really devoted clientele who start asking us right about now, when are you going to pick the Gold Rush? When are you going to have Gold Rush? And it's becoming one of the most popular cider varieties as well. The juice, it's a non-browning apple, meaning that it doesn't turn brown when you bite into it. And that, in this case, is probably because it has it has some ascorbic acid in the chemistry of the fruit. And it's gives you what's called a base cider, where if you have a lot of sugar and a lot of acid, that's always good for cider. The sugar sort of converts to ethanol, alcohol content, and the acid
gives you a low pH cider is more stable. You're less likely to have microbial problems. The fermentation is more likely to go through well. So if you have an apple that's very productive, disease resistant, a lot of sugar, a lot of acid, a lot of flavor, and makes a really good base cider, it's kind of a real best case variety for apple growers. The one downside to this apple is it ripens really late. This is the last apple that we pick every year, usually around the first week in November. So this apple and this little very dwarf tree is called Binet Rouge, and it's a very important cider apple from Normandy, the north coast of France. A very late ripening, lots of tannin, and the tannins of cider apples, the tannins can range from bitter to astringent, depending upon how large the polyphenol molecules are. And this one has very soft tannins, really elegant uh, textured tannins. So it's really it's one of our favorite cider varieties. And the tree it's a very weak growing tree, very flat limbed, lots of spurs, and these are spurs. They're short lateral shoots on apples. You can see them like here and here, and that's where next year's fruit's going to be. That's a fruit bud at the tip of that spur. And so a tree that has high density of spurs and it's fairly flat limbed, usually it's going to give you very good quality fruit and lots of it. Although this particular tree, this one that we're looking at, almost certainly won't have any apples next year because this is a little too much fruit for such a little tree. So we call that biennial bearing, and it's a very common trait in apples. It's almost the natural bearing habit of apple trees is to be 1 year on, the next year off. This is an apple called Redfield, or Geneva Red, actually was its original name. Came out of the Cornell Geneva breeding program in the early 1900s, so it's almost a 100-year-old variety. And it's a large fruited crab apple or small fruited dessert apple, depending upon how you view it. It's not really an eating apple, but it has this pretty good red coloration in the flesh on the outside of the apple. And the first rosé cider actually I ever had, and when I say rosé, I mean a real rosé, not one that's made by putting grapes or currants in with it. The first one I ever had was called Redfield, and the Maloney's made it. And it's really a lovely cider if you ever have a chance. They're not widely distributed, but if you ever see it, buy a bottle and taste it because it's a great cider. All right, I need to say a little bit about this apple, which is probably my favorite cider apple. It's called Porter's Perfection. And you can always tell Porter's Perfection because it does this. You have these sort of Siamese twin apples that are, this is like 1, 2, 3, 4 apples all sort of fused together. Very characteristic of this variety. There's a few other apples that will rarely do that, but Porter's Perfection, it's almost every tree you can find a fruit like that. It's a very productive cider apple. It's an old English variety from Southwest England, and we just won the Governor's Cup with a cider that's 50% Porter's Perfection, 50% Golden Russet. So it's been it makes really excellent ciders. It has a lot of tannin and a lot of acid and a lot of sugar, and the fruit will hang on the tree going into the fall, so you get what they call hang time in the wine industry. Basically, you can have it as ripe as you want it, depending upon how much acid and how much sugar you want in it. Really, I think I really encourage cider growers to plant this because it's one of the most reliable and uh, makes some of the best ciders of any of the varieties that we can grow here. And it's immune to apple scab, which is a really important disease, and also doesn't get much fire blight, which is another major disease that a lot of cider apples get. Okay, so from here east in this orchard, these are apple varieties from northern Spain, mostly Asturias, and that's
probably the original cider making region in Europe. Some people think that's actually where the cider apples as a distinct kind of apple were developed several thousand years ago by the Celts. That part of Spain actually historically was Celtic. It was the part of Spain that never got conquered by the Moors. The Moors occupied most of Spain for 800 years. In a lot of ways, it's still, you can really see the Moorish influence in Spain until you cross the Picos de Europa, get into the northern part, when it almost feels more like Ireland or Brittany. So I spent a month and a half there on sabbatical in 1997 when I was first trying to learn as much as I could about hard cider and cider varieties. And when I came back, I got a permit to import apple budwood, which you have to go through the USDA APHIS, the Plant Health Protection Service, to do that. And we brought 25 of the Asturian elites, so they're preferred cider varieties from Asturias. If you're not familiar with Spain, it's the north coast. There's Galicia is in the northwest, and then Asturias, and then San Sebastian, and then the Basque country. So they're all kind of along the northern part of the country. And the kind of the hub historically for the cider industry was in Asturias. In America, people usually know more about Basque ciders. But so these, I think this is probably the first commercial planting of Spanish cider varieties that we have, or at least the Asturias ones in the U.S. We have, I think, about 300 trees of them, and we're looking forward to, I don't know whether we'll sell this to cider makers that want to do Spanish style ciders, which is a misnomer, but I won't go into that. Or we'll make our own Spanish style, Asturian style, I should say, cider. But here they are. And this one here is Maria Elena, which is one of the few that's a high tannin variety. Most of them are actually sharps. They don't have a lot of tannin. And their ciders typically are quite acidic, often have a lot of volatile acidity or acetic acid. That's mostly a function of how they make the ciders there, more than it is the apple varieties that they use. Ready? So this apple, I'm really excited about having this on the farm. When these things produce a little more fruit, we're going to be able to make a 100% single variety rosé cider that's going to be just a fabulous cider. This is called Robert's Crab, and everything about this tree is red or purple, loaded with anthocyanins, so it's going to produce a really highly colored rosé cider. This is what the apple looks like, and that color is stable. Some red apples, you'll lose it during fermentation, but it has, actually, they smell really good even now before being fermented. Very aromatic. I first tasted this, Empire Cider did a test barrel of it, a single barrel, and I was visiting them 4 years ago and tasted that cider, and it just kind of blew me away. It looked like a Pinot Noir. It had that same amount of red pigment, and you could see through it. It wasn't, it was translucent, but intensely red. And the aromatics on it were red cherries, black raspberries, just some black currant. Amazing cider. So when I got home that day, I called up the germplasm repository and I asked if they could get me some budwood from it. And that winter I got budwood and I had it budded up at Wafflers. So we're going to have about 150 trees of this. These trees are just finishing their second growing season. And I expect that we'll have a fair amount of fruit on them next year. They're on a Geneva 11 as a dwarfing rootstock, very productive. So we're really looking forward to having some kind of we may call it Rosie's Rosé, named after our dog Rosie. So.
All right, that was excellent. Thank you so much to Ian Merwin and his team and Jackie and Rosie over at Black Diamond Farm. That was really quite special. Perfect way to start Sunday of Cider Week Finger Lakes. And I want to give a huge shout out to Rachel Freyer, who is our producer, phenomenal producer for all of our Cider Weeks. She shot that video and put it together, which was really awesome. So thanks, Rachel, for that. All right, so we are off and running. We're fully into Cider Week Finger Lakes. We have so much more going on. Later tonight, virtually at 5 o'clock, there's going to be a happy hour with Rootstock, and they're going to be making their apple bombs. So I will meet you right back here at 5 p.m. tonight. If you're out and about in the Finger Lakes area and you want to go and do something safe and socially distanced in person today at Lake Drum Brewing, they are actually making Papa Tacos al Pastor with Chef Segura. Now, I think that it's actually at a different location than Lake Drum Brewing, so be sure and check out our website, ciderweekflx.com. Go to the events tab and you'll find out all the details you need to know about the events that are happening. And also today, Eve's Cidery is doing a tasting at their beautiful cidery orchard location. So be sure and check that out as well. I think for that, you definitely need to have tickets because we are trying to keep things at a limited capacity to make sure that we can keep everyone safe. And there's so much more to come this week. Tomorrow night, we are actually having a cider trivia, which is being hosted by the Cornell Hard Cider team. So go on to our website, ciderweekflx.com, check out the events tab. There's an email that you need to email into to register for that, but it'll be a lot of fun playing some cider trivia during Cider Week. And then there's a huge array of more events throughout the week, both online and in person. There's some dinners coming up. I believe Rootstock is hosting a dinner on Thursday night. There's just some amazing events happening. There's some panel conversations. So check it all out. And we will see you around this week for Cider Week. Thanks so much for joining. And I'll see you back here tonight at 5 o'clock. All right, take care.
Cider Week Finger Lakes is brought to you by the New York Cider Association and is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors.